This entry in the vlog is about Catherine Savini's method for looking for trouble and how to kind of effectively employ those methods for writing project number one. So the goals for this entry is to discuss how to share what you notice in articles about your topic, how to articulate a problem and its details, how to develop an essay around that analytical kind of point and purpose, and I will be using a sample topic of my own to illustrate. That topic will be the current dissatisfaction by some viewers with the season 8 of Game of Thrones, the show, and also with its final episodes. I will say that this will be a spoiler-free vlog entry for the most part. I will not, so if you are actually viewing Game of Thrones and you're behind, I'm not going to spoil any plot details. The articles that I link in the description below may have spoilers, so be warned if you actually look at those. They may have a little bit, but for the most part, when I kind of overview these and talk about them, I won't be sharing any kind of detailed spoilers. So, my sample topic is that many people have expressed dissatisfaction with Season 8 of Game of Thrones online. And in fact, some fans have actually very clearly been angry about how the show has ended, or even as it was ending over the course of the season, they were trying to express this. So the basic narrative might be put as Season 8 of Game of Thrones is bad. Right? Or maybe more kind of carefully crafted Season 8 of Game of Thrones is less effective than previous seasons. We could obviously mediate this in some way. But I'll also say that it's valuable to narrow my focus here a little bit and not just go with the narrative that Season 8 of Game of Thrones is bad, but go to the notion that Season 8 of Game of Thrones should be remade. There was a feeling and a petition even launched saying, hey, they should remake this. This is not what we signed up for. So my task for this writing project would be to now look for articles that reflect and represent that popular narrative surrounding the show. The first place that I ended up when I did a little bit of a Google search for articles is the actual petition that says remake Game of Thrones Season 8 with competent writers. As you can see, over 1.5 million people have, or almost 1.5 million people have signed this, right? And it reads fairly simply, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss have proven themselves to be woefully incompetent writers when they have no source material, i.e. the books, to fall back on. This series deserves a final season that makes sense. Subvert my expectations and make it happen, HBO, right? And with that last line even playing on the subversion of expectations that often Game of Thrones, the show, was credited with. So that's the starting point. I also then found an article about this position on The Verge and was able to kind of look at elements from that. And then I have some other articles, including one that says Game of Thrones finale was actually pretty good. Don't be disappointed by an episode that played to the series' true strengths. And again, I won't go into details on what these say about the show itself, but we have a variety of articles here, some that kind of seem to just reflect what the petition says and others that maybe contrast it in some way. So the first step in Savini's method is to practice some noticing here, right? And again, to Savini, noticing is kind of the warming up that you do. It's when you're reading, you identify words, concepts, ideas, images that are surprising or that are repeated, maybe patterns that you kind of notice there, or things that perplex you, things that strike you as odd, or things that prompt further questions for you. When I look at the articles that I looked at there. The title of the original petition I think is even interesting. Remake Game of Thrones. There's a command there, right? Season 8 with competent writers. Okay, so there's some question of the competence of the writers and the writing that's at the center of this. So that's kind of interesting and worth thinking about. The word deserve in the petition that I read earlier, there's that sense of the show deserving something. When I read the Verge article by Sodic, there's a quote from the creator of the petition that says, we fans invested a wealth of passion and time into this series as kind of justification for that position. I thought that was interesting when I pair that with deserve and investing things. There's something of entitlement given that investment that's starting to kind of develop here. And also even just the sense of betrayal in several of the articles and several of the reactions that I saw online. There was a sense of something being betrayed, a trust and investment that fans had made that was being betrayed. So now I want to think about, well, how can I articulate larger problems or issues and their details by way of what I've noticed here, right? So it's about linking what you notice to larger issues that are, let's say, maybe not just in this case about Game of Thrones, but about television, our engagement with it, and so forth, right? That's where you want to think a bit larger. How's this, sure, about my topic, but also about the larger implications, the larger issues, right? And again, for Savini, you can look for tensions by juxtaposing texts on the same topic and identifying tensions or contradictions in terms of their ideas and or definitions of key concepts. Again, I had that other article from Slate that said that the finale wasn't that bad, and Dan Coyce on Slate says Game of Thrones was never going to find the perfect, incredible ending because Game of Thrones was never a perfect, incredible show. So there's something interesting there about, obviously, this expectation for something incredible and an articulation that maybe it wasn't always this perfectly crafted, always incredible thing, right? Consistently. You can also, to look for tensions, identify conflicts between your own experiences and the theories or arguments offered by the text. So I could think about, what are my own expectations for the finale? What were they? How are they different than other viewers? I can also think about how, as a viewer, I've actually come to terms and enjoyed endings of shows that many people haven't. For example, in the past, I may lose some members of the class here. I actually like the finales to shows like How I Met Your Mother, and I like the finale to Lost. And I know I'm often an outsider in those cases. But that's interesting. I can think about my own experiences and what was I hoping to get out of the finale versus how is that different from other arguments and other ideas about a finale. Right? You can identify troubling assumptions that underlie the central arguments or ideas of a text. Again, with the petition, there's something of that sense of deserving something, viewers deserving something, the show deserving something. I think it's assuming something about ownership of a text. It's assuming something about how viewers expect to get something very particular out of entertainment, out of art, out of films and television shows. And you can also note a gap or something relevant the text overlooks. The petition itself seems to overlook the high improbability of HBO actually remaking a show that they've invested millions of dollars in, right? And actually, I think in interviews, the creator of the petition kind of acknowledged that, honestly. Also, the impact of the petition on perceptions of the show as a whole. It seems to overlook that the show is defined by how it ends and not by what it's been over the course of 8 seasons, which is often something that's been beloved by a large viewership and fandom. So, what are the larger problems and issues that I would address in writing project number 1? If I'm articulating those larger problems and issues, I had those tensions. How can I build a sense and an articulation of larger issues and questions and problems? Again, problems being those issues to Savini. Well, I think one of them is ownership of stories and intellectual properties like Game of Thrones or Star Wars, comic book characters. I think that there's kind of an interesting question of, well, who owns this? Who's in control of this? I think when we get to the end of a show, we're starting to be told more and more what story the writers were telling, rather than the story that was in our heads might play out. Within that, we could get into the value of fandoms and communities. There's great value to fans, to communities of fans interacting, discussing things, talking about really positive issues. I think like discussions of the treatment of female characters, even within season 8 of Game of Thrones, was really valuable and interesting. But there's also, again, kind of a more toxic element within those communities, and this sense of ownership, this sense of demands, this sense of like what something should be giving us. Another issue, or actually that connects to current debates about these properties and what fans are owed, right? Another issue is how we engage with popular culture, right? What is it that we expect or want to get out of art, entertainment, and cultural texts? And I think considerations of what that engagement should look like, what's best for us as consumers, and what's best even for the creators, right? What realistic expectations should we have for these texts? And in particular, what expectations should we have for their endings, for their conclusion? So once I have identified the larger issues or questions or problems that I might articulate in writing project number one, how should I go about writing that? Well, in general, and this is not kind of a outline for this, but here's the things I should probably do, right? I probably should start early with introducing the controversy or conversation surrounding season 8 of Game of Thrones. And to do that, I can use quotation sandwiches and paraphrase to share what I notice when I read these articles, but also just to frame that larger conversation. What are people saying? What are they saying about Game of Thrones season 8? And then after I've established that, well, what do I notice within that conversation? What stands out? What's perplexing, right? Then I can use that evidence that I've gathered in those quotation sandwiches to extrapolate and articulate the larger underlying assumptions, gaps, or patterns in that conversation. Again, I can use multiple methods of looking for tensions, including using my own experience and observations, or I can look for patterns. I can look for those underlying assumptions or gaps. You don't have to use all of these, but you also don't have to only use one of them. You can use multiple ways of articulating those tensions between experiences or between texts. I should also consider the impact and stakeholders of this narrative. Obviously, we have the fans and their sense of ownership, but also the creators and their sense of ownership from the writers and directors and actors and the phenomenal work, let's say, with Game of Thrones in designing sets and costumes and lighting and all these kind of different elements that make up that show, right? There's stakeholders here and there's impacts of these words on it, right? Note that I do not have to argue that this narrative is necessarily right or wrong, right? I do actually think that there are issues and problems with season 8 of Game of Thrones as a fan. But that doesn't mean that I have to completely agree or disagree with this narrative that it should be remade or that it was all awful, right? Instead, I should be using writing project number one to consider the more complex issues and questions that it suggests. Okay. Now, in later steps, you'll notice that Savini's steps of looking for trouble also involve posing fruitful questions, right? We're going to pose those questions after writing project number one to allow us to delve further into research with these larger issues. But for now, the end goal of writing project number one is to highlight what's going on in a conversation or in a particular narrative and what are the bigger issues underlying it. Okay, it's analytical in purpose. That's its goal. And to do so kind of thoughtfully and with specificity and complexity. So let me know if you have any questions about this vlog entry or about writing project number one itself. On Friday, the 24th, I will also be adding an entry about the writing studies grading criteria and talk a bit about how it is going to be used for the evaluation of writing project number one. And until then, have a good rest of the week.